Hi, hello and welcome. This is an episode of Mid-Atlantic with me, Roifield Brown. Today we look into the heart of justice, equity and reform within the corridors of the US legal system with our special guest, Jeffrey J. Clayton, the Executive Director of the American Bail Coalition. If ever a topic is ripe for comparison from both sides of the Atlantic, it's bail and criminal justice reform. In the UK, the assumption leans heavily towards granting bail without the commercialised bail bondsman so prevalent in the US. This stark difference raises profound questions about freedom, equality and justice, especially when we consider how the American bail system disproportionately harms Black and poor Americans. The financial burden of bail in the US often means that wealth determines freedom pre-trial, a stark departure from the principles of justice for all and the presumption of innocence. We'll also discuss the significant divergence in state policies across the US. States like Illinois, New Jersey, and New Mexico are pioneering a move away from monetary bonds, recognizing the system's inherent inequalities and the detrimental impact on marginalized communities. Conversely, states such as Georgia and New York are starting to double down. There's an Americanism, if ever I heard one, tightening bail requirements in ways that promise to exacerbate these challenges. So Jeffrey J. Clayton, welcome to the show. You're the Executive Director of the American Bail Coalition. Tell me all about your organization, sir.
Absolutely. So we're a trade association, which basically means we advocate for things on behalf of our membership. Our membership are insurance companies who underwrite criminal bail bonds throughout the United States, which means we put up the guarantees when bail agents licensed, which is a unique thing in the United States, for-profit bail agents, which according to the U.S. Supreme Court take custody of defendants and underwrite a financial guarantee to make sure that they appear in court. Our members underwrite it. What do I do in my day-to-day business? Our business is controlled by the government, by the courts, by policies of the courts, by legislation, by local policies. And so there's always changes to those policies, and we're right in the middle of it, advocating on behalf of our industry for those policies. What I don't do is advocate for things to be crimes or not crimes, for sentences to be increased or decreased, or for bails to be increased or decreased. We just talk about what would be best practices within the United States for bail setting and release from jail pending trial.
In the UK, we don't fundamentally have cash bail in the way that you do, and most, if not all, industrial societies don't. To me, this seems incredibly perverse because it impacts the poor much more heavily than it does people who have financial means. If primarily the judge is going to use as a way of determining whether this person still has their liberty before trial the amount of money they have. Tell me I'm wrong.
Just to give this context, a snapshot of the impact of the U.S. bail system on economically disadvantaged individuals reveals that a staggering 37% of detainees find themselves in a position where posting the typical money bail amount of $10,000 is utterly unfeasible, as this sum exceeds their annual income. For the average detained defendant, the median bail bond amount equates to no less than 8 months of their income, underscoring the disproportionate burden placed on the poor, who are often left with no option but to remain incarcerated due to their inability to afford bail.
I think that's been the criticism, and I think that's a realistic criticism. I think that certainly does become an issue within the United States system of bails and how it operates. But the question is, what would be the alternative system? Our system, really, the break from the British system was United States versus Leary, was a conversation in a bar that happened in 1879. Which people didn't have a personal surety. And so it's really not a test of how much money you have. It's whether you have a personal surety, a third party that can put up for you. Originally, that didn't accompany, and the English system, that didn't mean a financial guarantee. It was, in other words, are you good for it? Are you going to answer for the charges, which means paying restitution, serving the sentence if the person didn't show up under the ancient common law, was what the original guarantee was. And in the U.S., that morphed into making a financial guarantee. Originally, that was never money out of pocket, and that's where things have changed. We've gone to a cash bail system. That is a creation of statute that's occurred after, and I do agree that's problematic. That is people putting up their own money. How much money does the defendant have? All of that sort of thing has become a problem. And the older days, and the way it's supposed to work is it's really a test of your ties to the community. Can you find a third party to put up a financial guarantee? And it was more about the third party than the size and nature of the financial guarantee. Right now, the way the U.S. Justice system has worked, I would say people even on the progressive side would be worried about getting rid of bail just because of how the criminal justice system functions in the United States and the problems with it. Your best move is to get away from the government. And I think bail offers a pathway out. And public defenders that I know and represent would say, don't get rid of a pathway, create more pathways out of jail, and bail being one that you probably wouldn't want to get rid of.
I think it's interesting you says you want to get the government out of this. Surely the legal system is the pointy end of the sword of the state. That's fundamentally it. The state is acting on the common good, on us as being part of the commons, the populace. So you can't really get it out. But as a Brit who loves many aspects about America, if you have something like 75% of people in some jails who are on pre-trial, so they're innocent, and then disproportionately they're black, they're minorities, they're the poor, that to me is a perversity of the system which just doesn't sit well with me at all.
I agree. I think the other thing that's occurred, and I'm writing a law review article about this, is the interjection of public safety factors and predictions of future dangerousness into the bail system in the United States. And that is also of a modern feature. And that has two impacts, right? If it's a system of detention, it means more detention of denying bail. And if it's a system of bail, it means what we call sub rosa detention, which means that the bail is set high because we think you're going to commit a crime in the future, which serves to detain you today. And we argue that shouldn't happen. We argue that bail should be based on whether you're going to show up and answer for the charges, not whether you're going to commit a new crime. And so that's been another feature that has led to this idea of greater pretrial incarceration. The other thing I'll say is just the length of the trials. The length of the disposition in the United States has gone disproportionately up. So when we're talking about, and I give South Carolina as the prime example, if you don't make bail in South Carolina and you're charged with a serious felony, guess how long on average? 2 years. 2 years. And so that is a sentence in a way. That is the death of you as a person when you're going to sit in purgatory for 2 years because you don't make a bail monetary or not. And if they denied bail, it'd probably be even worse because there'd be no incentive to do anything because the guy's never going to get bail. So that is a problem within the United States. We argue it should change, and that, as Thurgood Marshall once said, it's all a shortcut to a conviction. The system is doing all it can to convict you, but without actually getting there. And we see all the results of this, the no incentive to try somebody, leaving them to rot, or using sub rosa detention and all the other shortcuts that we're taking, electronic monitoring, house arrest, all this sort of thing, to just get to the end result.
Yeah, and if someone's going to spend 2 years in prison and technically they're innocent, it puts a whole nonsense to the notion that innocent are proven guilty because their personal connections have crashed. Their family is in disarray. They have lost their job. Their financial position has been massively impacted. Just, again, as a Brit, I just look at the American system around bail as being perverse. We don't lock up as many people as the United States does. Let's take bail out of it. The United States locks up more of its citizens per head of the population than any other major industrial nation. Even China locks up less per head. Now, that's specifically not anything to do with bail, but bail helps exacerbate that because these people are behind bars. So I find your position somewhat interesting and slightly nuanced, that you're from an organization respecting people within the bail industry, but you're advocating for some level of reform. Without being an expert on the US penal system and bail per se, surely what you guys want to do is just slightly tinker because you know there is some level of public opprobrium against bail, though it does fluctuate when there are, as there is in New York, the incidents of the policeman who was shot dead just at the end of March by somebody who had some 21 prior arrests. People are like, oh, there you go, and he was let out and this happened. Is your organization fundamentally arguing for some level of reform because there is this pushback in some sections of the American populace in a year of an election? you're doing a good PR job.
I'd say we were fighting for our life for the last decade. It's another way to characterize it. Get rid of money bail. Money bail is evil, and that took 10 years to really say, I don't think so. I think it's really, let's go somewhere else. What are we advocating for? I think is to go back to the future, to go back to a less incarcerated, quicker system of pretrial justice. If you're a prosecutor and you can't figure out somebody's guilty in 60 days, what are you doing? What does it take 2 years to figure out if somebody's guilty? The point is to establish guilt or innocence. That shouldn't take as long as it does. So what are we advocating for, I think, is to take the public and safety component out as a direct factor, to go back to appearance bonds, a system of appearance bonds, lower bonds, not necessarily even a more profitable industry, but a more sustainable long-term industry that makes sense. Because when somebody posts a high bond because the judge wants to keep them in jail because they're a public safety risk, if they post that, doesn't mitigate the risk. That puts the bail bondsman in a situation that they're not supposed to be in. We can guarantee they get appearance. And in the United States, we are a private party that has arrest power to bring them back, but we can't stop them from committing new crimes. And so the way the system is set up right now is flawed. Fundamentally, long-term, it's going to take reversal of the U.S. Supreme Court decision. There's a lot of changes that need to be made, but our organization is moving to make a generational shift on this. And we do agree. We do agree with the progressives that there does need to be less pretrial incarceration. On the other hand, we think that prosecutors need to go convict the people they need to convict. And if they don't want to convict somebody, get them out of the system. And all of the incentives need to change to make sure the system functions more smoothly. But I think it's more of a system that looked like 2024.
So you talked about the pressure that your organization has been under for the last 10 years, that there is this progressive push to have significant reform in this area. And you've also said that there needs to be some level of reform. Does that mean that in the forthcoming election that maybe your organization is endorsing certain candidates in certain races?
I don't think that endorsing candidates really is what we're looking at in terms of more just making a long-term shift in terms of what reforms are appropriate. And I can tell you what the progressives were advocating for that doesn't fly now is using a detention-based system using the risk algorithms. And that's what really got them under Proposition 25 in California, was that other progressives don't think we should be using algorithms to decide pretrial custody. And so if you look at the new bail schedule in Los Angeles, for example, if you're in this medium risk category and you get to go see a magistrate, they get to consider one factor, and that's your risk score on one of these computers. And that's dispositive. And so I think some of these reforms that the progressives were advocating for as an alternative to money bail have backfired. And so that's been our challenge, is to look through history, the constitutional traditions of the United States, and try to figure out how to have a less incarcerated, better justice system. And if you look at New York in the 1980s, they had the lowest pretrial incarceration we've ever seen and the lowest crime rates. And there's reasons for that. It was good enforcement. It was solid enforcement, but it wasn't gargantuan sentences that locked people away and threw away the key. It was good enforcement, consistent enforcement, and less mass incarceration. And it works. And I think we can get back to that.
With states like New Jersey, New Mexico, Illinois moving away from monetary bonds, and then others like Georgia and New York potentially trying to tighten bail requirements, is there a state, considering you just said pre-1984, that was, if not the halcyon period, that was a fair and more equitable period. Is there a state which you think has fundamentally got the balance right?
I'm not sure. I think Connecticut's probably one. Colorado's probably one that's doing a good job. I tend to look at the ancient rule states where we only have detention for capital cases. I don't think New Mexico is a particularly good example because they never funded the system. But New Jersey is a good example of an attempt of an alternative to the no money bail system, a system very similar to the federal system. But millions of dollars were pumped into that system. And at the end of the day, the racial disparities remain the same. And that was the whole reason we went down this road. And so we took this idea that if you don't post your bail, you stay in jail, and we'll substitute for that prosecutor saying, we think you're a flight risk and danger. And what we've seen over time is a growth in that population of prosecutors saying more and more dangerous, more and more detention. And so we started at a 20% detention, and now we're trickling up, and now prosecutors are filing in 1 out of 2 cases. And so over time, we've seen an increase in detention. And getting rid of money bail is one part of the equation. And then what we always talk about. And I think the New Jersey system proves that if you don't constrain detention, just like in the federal system, it'll grow. Illinois, we don't know. There's a new detention net, and we don't know what that is. There's roughly 1,500 cases pending for the Illinois Supreme Court to decide what that's going to be. And maybe it'll turn out better. Maybe it won't. And it's really hard to say at this point. It's a new experiment in bail. The laboratories of democracy is what we call it in this country.
So right now, what you guys are doing is advocating for the sector. Give us a sense of the scope of this advocacy. Does this mean that you have high-paid lobbyists sit in Washington wearing sharp suits, posing up next to senators and Congress people? Or do you take your advocacy for the system into other bits of the American populace? How does it work?
Well, lobbying 101, you can learn from a fellow Brit of yours, a guy by the name of John Oliver, who did a piece on state legislatures, well worth watching. It explains that only a handful of bills passed at the federal level, which, as my dad used to say, you can't pass gas on Capitol Hill, which basically means that nobody goes to Washington to do anything because it's all posturing. I think there were 160,000 pieces of legislation introduced at the state level in the last 2 years. All the action is in state houses, and that's where we go. Do we have high-paid lobbyists? In certain cases, we do. Generally, it's just
wearing sharp suits as well. These high-paid lobbyists.
Sometimes they do. We want to blend in with other insurance lobbyists. But at any rate, generally, it's more legal. The job is more following the legislation and trying to explain what is happening. We have legislation in California right now, for example, that's well-meaning, but it creates 3 new hearings. And while that's good for defendants, while that's our customers, and we encourage all of that, unfortunately, we think it's going to gridlock the system because they're not going to give new money. They're not going to get new public defenders and prosecutors and judges to do all these hearings. And so we think it's actually going to backfire. That's an example of just one thing where we have to go through and explain that. And of course, we will go meet with legislative leadership and talk about what's going to happen with legislation and go lobby individual committee members and explain, if you vote for this bill, this is what's going to happen. But that's typical within the U.S. system, typical within the insurance industry or any other industry that exists in the United States that's primarily doing business or controlled by the government, which we are.
John Oliver is not only a Brit like I am, he's not only from Birmingham, the same city as me, he's from Erdington, the same district of Birmingham that I'm from. But our careers have somewhat diverged since, though. He's a little bit more successful than I am.
You're on the right. And he also did a piece on money bail that's well worth watching as well that cost me a lot of headaches there for a while.
I will most definitely give that a watch. Give us a sense of how big the industry is in financial terms.
They say roughly that $15 billion in liability is posted by bondsmen in total amount of liability imposed. But you've got to add how much cash is posted throughout the nation, which would be, I would say, at least as much, plus property, the amount of property that's posted. It's hard to say. 10% is the rough thought of what premium is collected. That's really hard to say. Overall, I'd probably put it around $1 billion total premium collected throughout the nation by all of the roughly 20,000 bail agents throughout the country that function. As an estimate, again, because they're not all underwritten by insurance corporations, and some of them function as kind of part-time, unlicensed bail agents in some states, so it's really hard to estimate. So roughly, I would say $1 billion, maybe roughly $900 million in total premium collected, less expenses to operate and that sort of thing. So rough profit, maybe 500 million roughly nationally.
And just give me a sense, Jeffrey, in terms of what are the figures, let's say, pre the 1980s or pre the 1970s? I forget exactly the mark, but the date when things started to significantly change. In terms of people that just did not turn up. All right. So what was that pre this massive change and the industry becoming jet fueled in terms of the amount of people who are behind bars to what it is now?
You're saying, have we noticed a rate of people fleeing that has changed over time? In other words, has that justified the increase? I don't think so. No, is the answer. Because what we're doing is, with a system of sub-rosa detention, is we're predicting your future dangerousness and increasing your bond based on that. And so this whole idea of us guaranteeing your appearance in court hasn't changed. I don't think fundamentally. If anything, it's harder to run in this world than it was then. And I talk to bail agents all the time that recover people over international lines, for profit, which is a rare U.S. thing, right? Working with Interpol and all these other international organizations, which some bail agents are able to do. But how much does it take for us to get a guy out of Mexico, for example? What would it really take? And really, 100,000 is the answer. Beyond that is excessive. And so if we think the guy's going to run to Mexico and the bond is 300,000, that's probably excessive. And what we're really doing is predicting his future crime. So under our old models, maybe that 100,000 would continue if we thought he was going to run to Mexico, but it wouldn't be 300,000 because we thought he was going to go do it again. And that's the system that we've gotten to, unfortunately.
And again, just for an ignorant, simple-minded Brit, what happens to this money?
That is a whole other American story, which is that interest groups over the years have sought to intercept the bail proceeds when somebody fails to appear, which creates an incentive to have more money bail. And so we have certain judicial systems that can keep the monies. We have certain victims groups that can keep the monies. We have school districts that keeps the monies. They go to fire and police pensions in some states. So that creates an incentive to do it. In most states, though, it just goes to the general fund. And most state Supreme Courts have said the point of bail is not to enrich the Treasury. It's to guarantee the appearance of the defendant in court. But
that's a perverse incentive, though, isn't it? It's a bit like another thing which is incredibly shocking from a British perspective is the ticket violations and the fact that, I know this isn't specifically your area at all, but it's just looking at the American system from the outside. Ticket violations and the fact that certain police departments actually have a target of money they should raise. It's always incentivizes them to go out and to issue more tickets, and they do it in neighborhoods where people are poorer because it's easier to do that. And so there is an incentive, isn't there, for certain states just to go, let's push this number up, because actually it comes into municipal coffers through whatever means.
Using bail as a collections mechanism is as old as time. It's going on right now. We were thrown out of Wisconsin and we wanted to go back in, and the lobbyist there was like, no, the judges love their money now and you'll never forget it. Indiana, biggest abuser. Of course, the judges down in New Orleans had it made with the forfeitures until that was discovered by a federal court. So no more new credenzas, and the liquor fund is out the window at this point. So yeah, no, it creates a complete perverse incentive to impose bails that are unnecessary. To do low bails that we know are going to forfeit, that's what we've got going on in Indiana. We've got a litany of ton of low bails that really don't do much, except we know they're going into the coffers of the state. So yes, no, and that creates a perverse incentive. We've been all over that, and we've seen some lawsuits on that, and that definitely goes on.
Jeffrey, what have I not quizzed you on here? I do emotionally, politically, and economically line up with minorities and those people who find themselves economically disadvantaged, and then to have, in effect, another potential tax on top of the poor, because this is what this ends up being, is something which I find incredibly distasteful. So what should I have asked you, which I hadn't?
You should have criticized us for pushing for greater public safety and other benefits before I came along. But I will say, when I took this job, and why it is hard to criticize, is that we were going to lobby for freedom. We were going to lobby for what was right. And if we could make money along the way doing that, then that's how I felt comfortable being in this role. And that's what I came to discover. And part of this is because I worked on this issue since 1989, and I debated this as the pretrial mass incarceration grew under this bail reform. And that's why I understand where things are going. The other thing I think to criticize in this that is not necessarily us, but is partially us, is the growth in non-monetary pretrial conditions in this country, which is a much bigger booming business than bail. And what do I mean by that? I mean by ankle monitors, house arrest, drug testing, mental health, all this other type of stuff that we assign people on before they're convicted. And that is a bigger business than bail is. And probably now with the growth in apps and GPS and all this kind of stuff, Scram unit, I'm not if you're familiar, that monitors your blood chemistry 24 hours a day, see if you've had one drink, all that kind of stuff is going big. Defendants are paying for all that. A vendor, in fact, moved to Indianapolis, Indiana, because the state has no idea how much they're charging defendants. It's a lot, much more than their bail would have been under any of that. So I think that's another component of this, is we need to follow the money on that. And that's a major big business for people that haven't been convicted yet.
Why is it that the U.S. Constitution plays such a heavy role in the way that the American criminal system is developed? There's a 13th Amendment and I believe the 8th Amendment. Tell us why that's set up the bond industrial system the way that it has developed in the US in the last 230 odd years since the First Amendment.
Really, I think there's two ways to think about the American bail system. We start really with the federal system, the system of the federal government and what they do and what the states do individually, which is controlled largely by state constitutions. The federal government for time immemorial, really till 1984, and really breaking from the British system, was a system of no detention except for capital cases, which of course meant the death penalty. The death penalty obviously was used much more in colonial America and throughout the history of early America than it is now. But if you were charged with a death penalty eligible offense, you could be held without bail. And that was what was called the ancient rule within the United States. And that was tied to the presumption of innocence. The idea was, and this is from Blackstone commentaries on the other side of the ocean, that only the four walls of the prison could hold in these people for whom we were going to execute. That all changed in the 1970s and 1980s when actually we went against monetary bail. We were arguing at the time that we were holding too many people because they couldn't afford it. And so we went to this new federal system of preventative detention, of simply denying bail. And as a result of that, it has caused mass pretrial incarceration. Since 1984, we started at a 24% detention rate. We're up to 75% today. And we've substituted the evils of money bail in the federal system for a system of mass federal pretrial incarceration. So let's talk about what happens at the state level just briefly. States have different exceptions of when we can deny bail, and 35 state systems operate under a bail by sufficient surety system, which is a monetary system, a system of securing property, cash, or a monetary bond in exchange for your release. And like you said, a couple of other states are experimenting with that, but that's how the state systems have developed over the years.
So you've explained to me why between, let's say, 1970 and 2011, the number of people in pre-trial detention skyrocketed by some 433%. That's a totally shocking figure for me. Who does this benefit? Which organization does this benefit? Because not only is that kind of shocking, but the repercussions of this extend way beyond just those people detained. Society at large and its moral and societal ethics surely come at that cost as well.
I'm not sure it benefits in the purest sense, but here's what's going on. Bail challenges prosecutors to make a decision, to act. When somebody's at large and they're dangerous, we need to convict. And so it's not just that we've gone from 24% detained to 75% detained. We've also gone from cases resolving in an average of 60 days to 360 days. And so from a perspective of economics, what has happened is there's no incentive to get a conviction when you've already gotten preventative detention. And so we've slowed and we've increased mass incarceration as a result of that because we cannot challenge that decision. And unfortunately, that is an example of when you probably want monetary bail, when the community would challenge those decisions, when if people did have a right to bail or even a right to release, they would get out. So I think the federal experiment of no money bail has backfired. And I think commentators predicted that at the time. We knew, okay, we could engineer something better, but this probably wasn't going to be it.
The perception of crime also plays a real big part in the public's perception on monetary bail, doesn't it? Specifically, there's efforts in New York to roll back against monetary bail, but there was a police officer who was just murdered, I think literally just last week. And then all of a sudden, people are saying, no, he was murdered by somebody who had 21 convictions beforehand. And whilst there has been this spike in US crime rates post-COVID, they're falling. So could you explain to us that as a phenomenon, how the perception of crime really does affect people's attitudes around monetary bail, etc., and its efficacy? Does it actually work?
Within the halls of advocacy in the United States, one might call it playing the Willie Horton card, which was an old advertisement you could watch on YouTube from a presidential race some years ago. And I remember that quite
88.
Yes. And so perception does form a great part of reality. And we always say the crime numbers can say one thing, but if the polls say something else, that's what legislators are listening to. Unfortunately, on our issue, a spike in crime doesn't necessarily mean a spike in pretrial crime. It could mean, like we're seeing now, where maybe we have a new breed of crime going on. And I would suggest one of those is organized retail theft. That was not a big thing 10 years ago. And the fact that there are rings actually doing this and hitting these low targets where they can get away with it and then accumulate the benefits of almost like interest on a bank account by going real small and just adding it all up to something big is something that we didn't see. So I think that's another issue that's going on in the system right now. But definitely what the public thinks influences what goes on, and both sides play that. The reality is there's recidivists going crazy in general. And so we can always make the argument that this is the cause or that's the cause of recidivism. And it does distort the debate as to what's really going on.
It's really interesting that you talked about retail crime, because I spend 50% of my year actually in California, in the Bay Area. And the spike in retail crime was something which really made the news last year. So much so that Mayor London Breed, who was, let's say, famously more tolerant around low-level crime and the way that it should be dealt with, has completely done a whole 180 on that. And there has been talk, hasn't there, about some retail chains actually shutting up shop because of it. Do we have any reason why this relative spike happened? Is it even a spike? Or is it just that this thing has just now made the news?
I think it is a spike. Can I explain it? I don't think I can. Some people will try to argue that we lessened the penalties for certain things under Proposition 47, and that's driven it. I don't think so. I think it's just crimes of opportunities. It's just a change in human behavior that, for whatever reason, is occurring.
Wait up a moment. What is Proposition 47? Proposition 47, known as the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act, was passed by voters in California in November 2014. Its primary aim was to alleviate overcrowding in California's state prisons. It sought to achieve this by reclassifying certain nonviolent offenses from felonies to misdemeanors, including some drug possession offenses and property crimes, where the value involved is under $950, such as shoplifting, writing bad checks, and petty theft. The initiative also proposed to redirect the savings accrued from reduced incarceration costs towards school programs, victim services, and mental health and drug treatment. This measure has been a point of contention, with supporters arguing it allows the criminal justice system to focus more on violent and serious crimes, while opponents worry about potential increases in property crimes and the implications of lighter sentences for individuals committing certain types of offenses.
I was talking to the retailers as we were going through other conversations of bail. Where do you fit in on this? Is this an issue for you? And it wasn't. It really wasn't. I think they were just putting up with it until about a year or two ago. And I think that's when you've seen a lot of the Home Depot and other money going into financing the Proposition 47 overhaul that's going on right now, the signature gathering that's going on right now in California. And so I think the retailers are feeling the impact financially. What most people don't hear is that their own employees steal more from them than the public does. And I guess we're not too worried about that. We're not running ballot initiatives on that.
Jeffrey J. Clayton, the Executive Director of the American Bail Coalition, thank you for coming on to Mid-Atlantic. Just before we go, give us all of your web bona fides so people can log on to your website or message you if they need to.
And bailcoalition.org, also on X, formerly Twitter.
Let's just call it Twitter. It's just easier.
Yeah, I refused to update my app there as long as I possibly could because I wanted to keep it as Twitter, but
there you go.
All good things must die.
If you're on either side of the Atlantic, hopefully you've gleaned something from that conversation. I know for Brits, we're always shocked by the fact that people can give a certain amount of money and get their pre-trial freedom. They can be out on bail. One of the many faults that there are in the UK system isn't fundamentally a public perception that criminals are out on bail. And we do have this presumption of innocence and a presumption that somebody will turn up to a court date, which is slightly different from the way our American cousins do it. And hopefully what Jeffrey has done today is shine a little bit of a light on it. As I've said numerous times through this conversation, this is fundamentally a tax on the poor, and something which sits very uneasily with me. But in the quest for a more equitable and just bail system in the US, several organizations stand out in the forefront of bail reform advocacy, tirelessly working to address and to rectify the systemic issues that disproportionately affect marginalized communities. You have the Bail Project, which operates nationwide, providing bail assistance while pushing for systemic reform. The American Civil Liberties Union fights for a fairer justice system, including bail reform to ensure equality and justice for all. Equal justice under law is dedicated to ending wealth-based discrimination within the justice system, taking on the cash bail system amongst other issues. And lastly, there is the National Bail Fund Network, which serves as a vital directory for over 60 community bail and bond funds across the US. Together, these organizations offer a beacon of hope for meaningful reform and a fairer, more equitable legal system. One thing Jeffrey did say, which I thought was fair, is there is a culture and a tradition of this in the United States. So even if you want wholesale reform, it's going to be an incredibly hard thing to negotiate because the country fundamentally has been founded on these precepts. There is an industry, and Jeffrey is a proponent of that, and he has explained some of the difficulties in the system and admitted some of the problems. But please, let's continue this conversation. This is a really fascinating one. So it really does get at the heart of the difference between the US and the UK, considering the US legal system came out of the English system. So it's fascinating to see how the two systems have somewhat diverged. So on that note, why don't you continue the conversation on the Substack in the comments? You can send me an email, roifield@gmail.com. Also, what you can do is send me a voice note. So if you want to do that, go onto WhatsApp, +447 957 167 696, +447 167 696. And you can send me a voice note and we'll include that on a later show. That's one of the new innovations we're going to start doing on Mid-Atlantic, because on the Substack, there is starting to be some great conversations around some of the issues of which we are talking about. I've been Roifield Brown. This has been Mid-Atlantic, speaking to Jeffrey J. Clayton, the Executive Director of the American Bail Coalition. Take care. Look after yourselves. Bye-bye.